Hey, well, what's up, Colliders? Welcome back to The Collision. Daniel here to talk about that galaxy far, far away and beyond. Ahsoka, the latest sort of live-action Star Wars show for Disney Plus, has released its first full season. I've seen it, so let's talk about it. So if you're like a longtime Star Wars fan like I happen to be, you know that the character of Ahsoka has had a very tumultuous journey throughout her kind of creation until now. She was originally created for the animated The Clone Wars. And her initial reaction from fans was, let's just say, far from positive. A lot of hostility and sort of anger towards that character. But ultimately, just through the strength of good writing and good storytelling, she did develop into become sort of a fan favorite. A lot of people, now have kind of fallen in love with that character through the show and through some of the other resources. She was the first animated character in Star Wars to make the jump from sort of animation side to the live action when she appeared in the Mandalorian show, and now she is headlining her own 8-episode kind of live action series. And I think kind of consistent with her character's journey, the show Ahsoka might take some time to sort of win over viewers, but I do think ultimately this is a show that delivers, in my opinion, some of the best and more kind of most enjoyable Star Wars storytelling that there has been in years. And let me say from the front too that it's always difficult to review like a full season because there's just so much. Unlike a movie, you have hours and hours of storytelling. So it kind of this. Thought we'd dive into this in more sort of a broad brush, sort of more generalizations of sort of this, what I enjoyed about this series, what I maybe some of my nitpicks with it, and then ultimately, sort of as Christians, how can we engage with this? And it seems sort of among the fandom that Andor is generally praised as like the best live action Star Wars show. And I do think personally, I agree that it probably is the best show, just the most well-crafted, the best written show. I'm not as convinced that it's the best Star Wars show. I kind of felt that it was a great, a well-made show set in the Star Wars universe, but it lacked a lot of the kind of classic elements that at least people like me and others associate with Star Wars. And well, I think Ahsoka kind of lacks some of the sophistication in the writing and just in the craftsmanship. What it doesn't lack is a lot of those old school, good old Star Wars vibes. A lot of the classic stuff that made people like myself fall in love with Star Wars are very much present in Ahsoka. You have exciting lightsaber battles and space dogfights and sort of the mystical aspect with the Force and the Jedi kind of is once again a focus, which is sort of being diminished in like The Mandalorian and in Andor. And I would also say this probably has the best Star Wars music in any of these shows, sort of this side of John Williams. I also appreciated that this show kind of returned to some of the more like generational accessibility of the show, which was sort of lost with a show like Andor, because it tried to be a more mature storytelling, which was fine for what it was. But as a parent with kids that also love Star Wars, I did appreciate that this was a show that could be enjoyed by sort of all of us at different levels. Which does mean, like, as an older viewer, that there are there are goofy parts. Is it goofy to watch a bunch of space whales migrate as like characters watching on? There's dramatic movie music playing. Of course, it's goofy, but I think Star Wars has always sort of had some of that silliness that's sort of part of its charm. That even if it does, like this show, I think does delve into some more nuanced and kind of deeper themes, it also has some of that kind of fun adventure sort of available to all ages sort of goofiness. I say too, despite being season 1 of Ahsoka, this show is probably better understood as season 5 of Rebels, which was the animated Star Wars show that aired from 2014 to 2018. And kind of even beyond that, sort of the first chronological episode of this series really took place in Mandalorian season 2, where you introduced one of the villains and you introduced Ahsoka kind of in live action. And such is sort of the nature of us storytelling today in cinematic universes and sort of interconnected stories and tied into this and that and other resources. I don't think that viewers sort of less familiar with these prior stories will necessarily be lost or be unable to follow the plot or enjoy the excitement of the action or become invested. Although I do think this show very much assumes from the start that audiences have a prior emotional attachment to these events and to these characters in ways that the show itself doesn't necessarily depict or earn or sort of show you why this matters. It sort of assumes that you already have some of this history. And again, I don't think there's anything wrong necessarily with a Star Wars show that is building off of other Star Wars shows and Star Wars mythology. I think that's fine. But I do think that maybe viewers, much like Luke Skywalker in the Cave on Dagobah, some of the enjoyment I think will depend sort of on what you bring to it. Another aspect I really enjoyed about Ahsoka is that I felt like it had a sense of sort of forward motion and purpose, which some of viewers might not agree. I have seen some complaints about the pacing of this show and that it felt like the show is sort of spinning its wheels. And I do think that it doesn't always, those complaints are valid. There is some pacing stuff. The show doesn't always move forward, at the speed of, hyperspace travel. But I do think that it is constantly sort of heading towards a direction. You kind of lose some of the superfluous sort of unrelated sort of side missions that really bog down a season like the last Mandalorian season, which just seemed like you constantly lost the thread of the main narrative. With Ahsoka, everything does seem like it's moving towards a specific point. And kind of across the board, all the characters have they have their own motivations and goals and arcs that are established in the first episodes and then are pursued throughout the episodes. And for the most part, except for a couple cliffhangers at the end, there is sort of resolution. So there is sort of a unity to the whole season, a self-contained nature that I do think has been lost in some of the other Star Wars stories. Speaking of the characters themselves, Ahsoka probably isn't, at least not on this stage of her character's life, the most compelling lead character. She sort of is in that wise mentor, like Obi-Wan Kenobi role, which at least in the first couple episodes of the show, does make her a little bit too kind of serene and wise, and she lacks some of the energy and the spark that defined her animated, kind of younger animated character, at least until about halfway through one of the best episodes in Star Wars recent history, where she does sort of undergo some sort of rebirth and does regain some of that more, the levity and more of the warmth to her character that was missing. And speaking of other characters that were missing and making their return, Hayden Christensen makes his return once again as Anakin Skywalker, and he crushes it. It is so good to see him in this role. Definitely, I think without question, this is the best performance that he has given sort of as Anakin Skywalker. And also great in this is the late, great Ray Stevenson, who sadly died just prior to the release of this series, as sort of a disillusioned former Jedi that has kind of murky motives. And he is, without question, sort of the most captivating presence in this whole show. And I would say just sort of in general, the villains in this show are awesome. They are in many ways more compelling and exciting than even the heroes in the show. Every one of them, there's a kind of a collection of different heroes, and all of them have kind of defined motivations, and they have nuances, and they don't feel like just sort of, mustache twirling, just sort of, copy and paste. We need a bad guy in Star Wars. All of them are very much characters in their own right, and I think definitely one of the most interesting parts of this show. As far as content to consider, kind of things going on the surface of this, really not a whole lot. Mostly this stuff that is consistent with storytelling, Star Wars storytelling that we've become familiar with. Language, there's no language in this. Violence, just sort of the standard kind of typical Star Wars violence where characters are shot with blasters and sliced with lightsabers. Again, nothing bloody or gratuitous in any way for the violence. Sexuality, no sexuality. Maybe the only other thing as far as content, again, this is mostly to be expected from a Star Wars story, but the Force is very much sort of front and center throughout a lot of this, sort of the mystical power of the Force, and there's a lot of training to tap into the Force and discussions about what the Force is. So there's definitely that, but kind of beyond just that standard, sort of the mystical nature of Star Wars, there's also a group of these sort of witches of Dathomir, which they've appeared in other the animated shows, who sort of use force power, but it's more has the aesthetic of magic. Even one of the characters, Thrawn, refers to it as dark magic. So it is kind of has more horror inspirations, I guess, for the powers that they're using, maybe beyond what is typical of Star Wars. Again, I personally didn't find that a problem. They're very much evil characters, but I know maybe some Christians will just want to have a heads up for that. As far as themes, kind of things going on beneath the surface of this show, there's some interesting stuff that kind of gets explored, and it's interesting because it gets explored through different avenues and through different character journeys, and kind of the main through line, kind of thematic thread in this is sort of the nature of the Force. What is the Force? Sort of who can tap into the Force, who can't tap into the Force, kind of what is the Force, and kind of as an extension of that, and sort of what is the role of sort of the traditional kind of religious structures or institutions that do sort of relate to that power. Because in many ways, Ahsoka, the show, kind of recontextualizes what the Force is. It's sort of established in early Star Wars stories that the Force is sort of this great power beyond us, and we sort of reach out and kind of commune with this power that is sort of out there in the world. Where there's an interesting conversation, I think maybe in like episode 2 or 3 of this show, where Ahsoka is talking to Sabine and kind of teaching her about the nature of the Force, and kind of explains that no, like, the Force is in everyone. Everyone has access to the Force. It's not just the Jedi. It's not just the Skywalkers, but actually anyone has that potential to reach sort of within themselves and find that power. And obviously there's talent and you need training, but it is very much more like a universal power that is sort of more internalized rather than the sort of external force that we relate to, which is just an interesting, I think, reflection of sort of where we are as a culture. I actually wrote an article that sort of did a deeper dive into like some of the meaning of that. I'll drop that in the description, because I do think as a Christian there are some interesting kind of thematic things to work through with that. And kind of, like I said, related to that, sort of the other sort of theme that gets unpacked with this is how do characters relate to the Force, and kind of with like the past and the structure, the institutions, the Jedi. And you kind of see that through two characters. Ahsoka is very much wrestling with her own sort of legacy, and Anakin Skywalker's fall to the dark side, and the Jedi let her down, and the galaxy has fallen into chaos, and what is her kind of guilt in some of that. And kind of on the other side, you have Baylan, which is Ray Stevenson's sort of villainous character, who is a former Jedi, but very much while he's like disillusioned by the Jedi, he's clearly still hanging on to some respect and some sense of loss. Like there's an interesting conversation with him and his apprentice Shin, who is also great in this, where she asks, do you miss the Jedi? And he responds, I miss the idea of the Jedi, but not the truth, not the weakness of what that institution became. And despite sort of that negative sort of memories of the Jedi, like even his apprentice still has she has her Jedi braid as an apprentice, and he still speaks very respectfully of a lot of the Jedi. So it is this sort of interesting theme where these characters they're sort of almost like a post-Jedi culture, and they're both from different angles wrestling with what does that mean? What does that mean with how they relate to the Force? How much of that do they maintain and keep and preserve? How much of that was weakness that should be discarded? And I do think this is a show that very much isn't really about trying to give answers to those questions as much as it is showing characters sort of wrestle through that. And as a Christian, I think there is definitely relevance in just sort of what we see in our own culture and sort of the whole deconstruction movement, and just a lot of people that either grew up in the church or just sort of have mixed feelings towards the church, and kind of wrestling with, what is that spiritual power that I relate to? Like, how does that relate and kind of have meaning with these institutions, these traditions? So I do think there are some interesting, even if it doesn't necessarily give a whole lot of answers, there are some questions that are worth Christians sort of wrestling with. So in the end, I found Ahsoka just an enjoyable return to that galaxy far, far away. And I think also just a return to form. I think a lot of the recent shows, in my own opinion, like the Book of Boba Fett and the recent Mandalorian and the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, were just very underwhelming for me. They had good moments, but just not memorable, not anything that I would ever go back and watch again, or that I ever really felt that invested with beyond just, hey, it's Star Wars, might as well watch some Star Wars. Where this show very much, I felt an investment, kind of a connection back to the Star Wars that I grew up with and that I loved. It has some problems. There are some pacing stuff. There are some storytelling stuff that I think you can kind of nitpick. But overall, I really enjoyed this show, and definitely looking forward to kind of season 2 of it. But hey, let me know what you guys think. If you guys watched through this whole show, did you enjoy it? Were you invested? And maybe if you, whether you watched like the Rebel show or you went in blind, would love to hear just sort of how that informed your engagement with this show. So jump in the comment section. Let's talk about it. And if you haven't done so, I encourage you guys, subscribe to our channel, become a Collider. Just join with what we're doing here. We got reviews and live streams and this other stuff. Would love to have you be a part of that. But most of all, guys, thanks for watching. Stay safe and continue to collide through World for Christ.